And we are excited today that we have a very esteemed panel of experts who are going to talk about Armenian-Russian relations in the past and present. The panelists, as you can see, are Tom de Waal, Artyom Tonoyan, Stephen Badalyan Riegg, and it will be moderated by Arpi Movsesian. I'd like to introduce Arpi first, and then she will be introducing the speakers, and she will moderate the session. Dr. Arpi Movsesian is a scholar researching on literary history and performance in English, Russian, and Armenian. As an assistant professor on Russian at the University of Notre Dame, Movsesian examines the 19th century political and radical movements in the Russian Empire, and the blueprints for revolutionary activity and atrocities in the 20th century. Arpi has book and article publications on Dostoevsky, Shakespeare, and other writers, as well as on Soviet Armenian literature, and is currently examining the directionality between the center and the periphery in colonial and post-colonial context in the South Caucasus. Movsesian's second book project is entitled Bloodied Ballads, Living Empires, Transculturality in Armenian Lyrical Verse. Arpi, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Thanks to you and also to the ARPA Institute for the invitation and for opening up this important dialogue about Armenia-Russia relations. And of course, to our participants as well for agreeing to bring their expertise to this discussion. And we're all looking forward to it. Just wanted to mention that the order of speakers is as follows. So Stephen Badalyan Riegg, then Tom de Waal, followed by Artyom Tonoyan. The discussion questions will be addressed after all these three participants have spoken, and audience members can stick around for an elaboration of points and perspectives after that. So the discussion will be followed by audience questions and closing remarks by our participants as well as the Institute. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Stephen Badalyan Riegg, who's Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M. His research and teaching focus on Russia, Eastern Europe, and comparative empires. Stephen's book entitled Russia's Entangled Embrace, the Tsarist Empire and the Armenians from 1801 to 1914 won the Best Book Award from Ab Imperio, and as well as Dr. Sona Aronian Book Prize for Excellence in Armenian Studies. Stephen, thank you for being here. The Zoom floor is yours to offer remarks on Armenia-Russia relations, please.
Thank you very much, Arpi, for that introduction. And I want to express my gratitude to the ARPA Institute for having me and to all of you for coming to this discussion today. It's really good to see names, familiar names, new names, not only from the US, but also from Armenia itself. So I want to start with the main focus of my work, which is Russian policies towards Armenians in the 19th century. I want to start by emphasizing that for much of the 19th century, Russian officials saw in Armenians of the South Caucasus a fount of far-reaching political and economic benefits. The strategic cooperation of Armenian meliks, clergy, and peasant volunteers during the two Russo-Persian wars, compounded by fables of Armenian mercantile prowess and Russian dreams of Echmiadzin's global authority, cemented in the Tsarist political imagination an image of the Armenian nation as its indispensable regional ally. In practice, this is the crux of my argument, in practice, this was a complex relationship exemplified by the simultaneous privileges and restrictions placed upon the Catholicos by the Statute of 1836, the Положение of 1836, But the general Russian posture, the overall overarching Russian posture toward Armenians until the last quarter of the 19th century, that means until the 1870s, was accommodating. In the socio-political realm of the South Caucasus, from the point of its annexation by Russia, the Tsarist-Armenian encounter was largely symbiotic, as exemplified by the general coordination of Echmiadzin and the Russian state, the absence of a Georgian-style peasant or aristocratic protest at Russian rule, and the steady trickle of positive assessments by regional Tsarist officials of the political reliability of local Armenian communities to St. Petersburg. The maintenance of Armenian autocephaly, in sharp contrast to the experience of the Georgian Orthodox Church, the maintenance of the Armenian autocephaly, the efficient integration of the small but important Melik elite into the Russian table of ranks, and a record of centuries of close interaction between Russians and Armenians all coalesce to lubricate the gears of that integrationist project. Yet Russo-Armenian political ties before and after Russia's expansion into the South Caucasus evolved within broader international developments that affected the course of ostensibly domestic Tsarist politics. By the second half of the 19th century, the reverberations of the Eastern question and the plight of Western Armenians shook the foundations of the Russo-Armenian political partnership with the rise of Armenian nationalist parties and the heavy-handed reaction of rightist or reactionary Russian officials. Yet, this was a gradual deterioration and one that resulted, arguably, in only a temporary collapse of the Russo-Armenian symbiosis. While the influential Viceroy Vorontsov, Mikhail Vorontsov, at mid-century had been a champion of Eastern Armenians as trustworthy regional allies, the era of modern nationalism and reaction after the Polish uprising of 1863 and the restrictive politics of Alexander III yielded new security priorities and necessitated new scapegoats. In the closing decades of the century, the pan-imperial turn toward Russification and a fanatical pursuit of real and imagined revolutionaries into the deepest crevices of the borderlands resulted in the confiscation of Echmiadzin's properties in 1903. Their return 2 years later soothed the unprecedented anti-Russian agitation of the global Armenian diaspora, but the harm to the relationship was deep. Moreover, by the twilight of the Romanov era, the social prominence Armenian merchants had accrued through their dominance of the region's commerce also secured the animosity of their Muslim and Georgian neighbors toward the broader Armenian population. So this is the context, folks, in which we transition to the Soviet era. And two of my colleagues will focus more on the late Soviet era, but I want to set up the foundation in 2 or 3 more minutes of elaborating. The October Revolution brought a new regime that was internationalist in aspiration, imperial in modulation, interethnic in composition, and it would later emerge constructivist in nationalities policy. If the Tsarist regime had been satisfied with stability and economic growth as long as its subjects did not resist its rule, the Bolsheviks proclaimed a mission to transform society fundamentally. As ardent anti-imperialists, the Bolsheviks harnessed the fervor of decolonization while seeking to use the vast territory and diverse population of the defunct Russian Empire as the foundation for a centralized socialist state. Lenin insisted that class would trump nationalism only if and when national identity was given space to mature and then atrophy on the new society's path to internationalism and communism. The Bolshevik leadership reasoned that by tolerating the forms of nationhood, the Soviet state could turn above class national solidarities into class-based antagonisms between national elites and their masses, thus exploiting newly widened cleavages and recruiting national proletarian and peasant allies for the Soviet socialist project. This agenda required the creation of a dozen large national republics and tens of thousands of national territories. We call these 15 national republics titular republics. And at the titular level, the restless cosmopolitanism of the cities and the dizzying tapestry of the rural districts, which had been the staple of the imperial era, gradually gave way to more monoethnic, nationally and linguistically self-segregated spaces defined by more formal boundaries than ever before. Many Armenians continue to live in the Azerbaijani SSR, and many Azerbaijanis continue to live in the Armenian SSR, but the allure of a quote-unquote national home was too great for their majorities. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, for example, Georgians and Armenians were part of an exclusive club that attained authoritative positions in the all-union party and central government, while Azerbaijanis and many other quote-unquote Eastern peoples enjoyed less social mobility and held fewer central positions, feeding an undercurrent of new resentments built on old rivalries. As Ronald Grigor-Suni has argued, an irony of the Soviet political ecosystem is that it tolerated no nationalist expression, yet it ended up implicitly gestating national consciousness. Rather than sweeping nationalism into the wastebasket of history, Soviet nationality policy calcified ethno-national identities rooted inside particular borders and often embroiled in the type of competition where only winners and losers could emerge. I'm going to shut up there and let my colleagues speak. Thank you, everyone.
Stephen, thank you for this historical overview and for emphasizing the complexity of this relationship. Too often, I believe, events or relations are treated as if they're isolated phenomena, right? So we appreciate you taking us back, not just 3 decades ago, for example, but to earlier time periods to understand the present better. Our next speaker is Tom de Waal, with whose work I'm sure most of you are familiar if you are following the events in the Caucasus. Tom is a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, and he's the author of numerous publications, including the books The Caucasus, an Introduction, Great Catastrophe, Armenians and Turks in the Shadow of Genocide, as well as Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War. Tom has worked for Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., as well as he's been a journalist for BBC Radio, Moscow Times, Times of London, The Economist, etc. His co-authored book on Chechnya received the James Cameron Prize for Distinguished Reporting. Tom, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Arpi, and thank you very much to ARPA for the invitation. I hope you can hear me. For some reason, my Wi-Fi went down, but I'm talking to you on my phone. Good evening, everyone from London. Yeah, I want to sort of begin in the present because I'm sure that's what a lot of people would like to talk about, but also look back in the past. What we're witnessing really at the moment is an unprecedented, I guess, almost unprecedented, as Stephen has reminded us about 1903 and other occasions, but an extraordinary, shall we say, breakdown in Armenia-Russia relations at the moment. Obviously, we saw what was, I think, unprecedented, which was a Russian peacekeeping force standing down in Karabakh, which allowing the Azerbaijani military to enter and take over Karabakh in September, something the whole Armenian world obviously noted with horror. And that surely is unprecedented, a Russian peacekeeping force standing down and not doing the job it was sent to do. So we're seeing this breakdown in Armenian Russian relations, with Prime Minister Pashinyan taking Armenia into the International Criminal Court, saying that he sees no utility in the CSTO, the Russian-led treaty military organization of which Armenia is part, and many other symbolic gestures, such as sending his first lady to Kiev to a meeting of first ladies, and in the recent European summit in Spain, meeting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. So I think in parallel, obviously, we're seeing a real reconfiguration, because we're also seeing a breakdown in Azerbaijani-US relations. I don't think I mean, that they've always had their problems, but the US has had quite a strong partnership on many issues with Azerbaijan. That's also breaking down. I would just refer you to, in the last 24 hours, to a quite ferocious attack by the main foreign policy advisor, Hikmet Agiyev, on Samantha Power's and USAID. So is what is happening unprecedented? I would say it's not completely new. I would refer you to the period 1988 to 1991, a period in which I've done a lot of research and I think interviewed most of the main participants in those events, and of course remind you that amazingly, really, Soviet Armenia was the first rebel in the Soviet system under Gorbachev. That the first mass demonstrations, the first mass defiance of Soviet rule came from Armenia, not from many other places you might have expected it, like Central Asia or the Baltic states or Georgia. That happened in 1988. And between 1988 and 1991, relations between Yerevan and Moscow were pretty strained. The center, as it then was, tended to support Azerbaijan on the principle of protecting Azerbaijan's integrity against secession by the Karabakh Armenians. But there was a kind of split in the leadership. If you will remember, back in the Gorbachev days, he had two main advisors: Alexander Yakovlev, who was the founder of Glasnost, the liberal, and Yegor Ligachev, who was the conservative. And Yakovlev, pretty much had great sympathy for the Armenians, and Ligachev for the Azerbaijanis, and that split deepened, such that the new Russian authorities, led by Boris Yeltsin, then openly sympathized with Armenia, while the Soviet authorities in 1991 backed Azerbaijan, and indeed, when the August 1991 coup d'etat happened, the Azerbaijani leadership backed the coup d'etat. So that was a kind of split, and in a way, in Moscow, in a way, I think we're seeing echoes of that. That when a Moscow which is not interested in democracy, not interested in reform, but interested in purely transactional economic type relations, has a clear interest in Azerbaijan over Armenia at the moment. Why did Moscow trade away its peacekeeping force and Karabakh and its relationship with Armenia? Well, I think in the context of the war in Ukraine, trade routes to the south are much more important. Moscow's only railway line to the south along the Caspian Sea, the main one goes down through, and that kind of connectivity is now absolutely vital for Moscow in the context of the war in Ukraine and encirclement from the West and the sanctions regime, whereas Armenia is offering much less by the way of partnership. Obviously, I think Russia plans to keep its hold on Armenia. There's heavy dependence. The energy sector is particularly worrying for Armenians if they want to free themselves of Russia. If we're talking about 85% of natural gas comes from Russia, the hydroelectric sector, the nuclear power station supplied by Rosatom, the gas pipeline to Iran, we could go on. So a particular dependence on energy, and of course the base in Gyumri, and also the Russian bodyguard. So there's a pretty tight control, really, in many ways, of Armenia. And then, of course, we have the political groups who are still allied with Russia, the two opposition parties allied to the two former presidents. So what we're seeing, I think, is a kind of generational change, though, in which Nikol Pashinyan is more akin to Zelensky than he is to Ilham Aliyev. These are people who grew up, who were born in the 1970s, who weren't educated in Russia, like someone like Ilham Aliyev. They don't have the kind of elite links that the Azerbaijani elite, for example, has to Moscow, and that, I think, is incredibly important. So just, I think what we're seeing, I think, is also, and this is the traditional, West-East Armenian split. What is the Armenian question? Obviously, for someone like Pashinyan, for East Armenians, it is the Armenian state. And just one other thing I would allude to, I didn't mention, was that when I was doing my interviews with those leaders of the Karabakh Committee, people like Levon Ter-Petrosyan and so on, who brought Armenia to independence in 1991, that they would often complain that diaspora groups were rather late to support them, and the advice coming from abroad was also, don't break your dependence on Russia. That leaves Armenia exposed to Turkey. They obviously saw it in a very different frame. They saw Armenian independence, I think from about 1989, as the absolute priority. And I think many of those people would say that Armenia made strides in the 1990s to free itself from Russia only under Robert Kocharyan to become recoupled to Russia economically through all the assets for debts swaps and many other schemes with Russia. And perhaps what we're seeing at the moment is as it were a third attempt for Armenia to get free from Russia and have a more independent foreign policy. Let me stop there. Plenty more to say, but let me pass the baton on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We're looking forward to hearing more about the current orientation of the countries in question here, as you said, during this historic moment. Our final speaker is Artyom Tonoyan, who's a sociologist and a visiting professor of global studies at Hamline University in Minneapolis. He's the editor of the book entitled Black Garden of Flame, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in the Soviet and Russian press. Artyom's current research focus is sociology of religion and politics in the South Caucasus, as well as religion and nationalism in post-Soviet Russia. Artyom's articles have appeared in the journal Demokratizatsiya and others. He has also been a frequent guest on the BBC, France 24, and other prominent media outlets. Artyom, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arpi, for the introduction, and thank you, ARPA Institute. I just realized they sort of rhyme for organizing this event. And I also would like to thank my co-panelists in giving a great tour d'horizon, the tour of the horizon of the current state of affairs, from Armenia's difficult, complex, complicated entanglements with Russia to its current difficult, complex, complicated entanglements with Russia. So that nothing, it seems, has changed since the days of Israel Ori, when the Armenian leadership looked, or rather recalibrated its gaze as to whence its salvation will come from the yoke of the non-Christians and so on and so forth. And I mentioned Israel Ori not because I wanted to drop his name, but because I wanted to make a further point. And I am, in this bunch of presenters, probably the most perennially attuned to complaining about our lot. And as Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, once said, it's easy to diagnose, it's not as easy to heal. But I'll give you sort of a diagnosis of where the relations are and what will probably happen down the road, or I hope will not happen down the road. So when it comes to Armenia's sort of entanglements with Russia, I am reminded over and over again by one of my favorite writers ever, probably my favorite writer of all times, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, who has this wonderful novel called The Demons, or The Devils. And in this novel, there are quite a cast of interesting, colorful, boring characters who occasionally come to blows, but occasionally also want to change the Russian state of being. And one of these characters, an engineer named Kirillov, I think his name was Kirillov, or at least his last name was such, during one of these conversations with his fellow minds and fellow revolutionaries, says, listen, I don't have the slightest knowledge of the Russian people, and I have absolutely no time to study them. And I think the last couple of 100 years of Armenian entanglements with Russia has been sort of characterized by this attitude. Russia is complex, Russia is vast, Russia is great, therefore it casts a great shadow, and what is there to understand but to abide under this shadow, or within this security canopy that it has to offer to the imperial subalterns that Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Georgians, and Central Asians are. And another sort of attitude that has dominated in the Armenian political thinking and when it comes to Russia is probably best captured by another Russian writer, Fyodor Tyutchev, who very famously once wrote a poem about the Russian, how Russia cannot be understood by mind alone, that it stands alone, unique, and you can only believe in Russia. And so the Armenians have become a victim of this complicated and complex attitude, have internalized it through various means of socialization, through the educational system, and through the popular culture, and through the unpopular culture, and sort of have become have eschewed agency when it comes to our relations with Russia. And one of the most catastrophic results of this eschewing, of this misunderstanding, and this sort of miseducation has been the breakdown of relations with Russia, the inability to form partnership with Russia or any other number of countries based on pragmatic self-interest. States need to have some sort of self-interest driven policies. But Armenia, for the last couple of centuries, but especially the last probably couple of decades, have sort of internalized this and have been walking in place. There hasn't been a robust development in the educational system that would look at Russia through the latest methodological lens and trying to disentangle this complicated web, and we sort of stand to reap the opposite of what benefits are in this relation. And Russia, as I have on many occasions said, and I would like to belabor the point here, is that when it comes to the Caucasus, and when it comes to the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, when it comes to any number of issues having to do with the Caucasus, Russia has occasionally been, pro-Baku, has occasionally been pro-Yerevan, but at all times Russia has been pro-Russia. But sort of this logic has escaped us. And Joan Didion, the great American journalist writer who recently passed, has a fantastic book called The Year of Magical Thinking. And it looks to me that we have been made our abode in magical thinking, not for a year, not for a decade, but for 2-3 centuries. And it is, I think, a time, it is a high time to sort of be more pragmatic on these issues and develop a more pragmatic approaches to understanding not just only Russian politics, but geopolitics and regional politics with the cold gaze of a scientist in a laboratory, rather than being enchanted by any number of things. So I will stop here. I think I gave you enough of an attitude and enough of what I wanted to say, and then we can go from we can do the Q&A.
Thank you, Artyom. Thank you for the overview, or maybe I should say diagnosis. Thank you for the diagnosis. We're eager to hear more about your take on this relation, especially the ways in which Russia has been, as you said, pro-Russian. And of course, I personally appreciated the Dostoevsky-Kirillov reference from Demons. I want to go to the questions now. I'd like to direct my first question to Tom about Russia and its distractions in Ukraine. You know, if Russia wasn't distracted in Ukraine or in desperate need for the trade routes that run through Azerbaijan, as you mentioned, would it have been more involved and effective in its role as mediator or even in its peacekeeping mission? After all, you know, the trilateral agreement from 2020 states that one of the tasks of the Russian peacekeepers there was the protection of the Lachin corridor, the passage between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, which was absolutely not the case, as we know, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the war in Ukraine changed Russian calculations quite fundamentally. You know, Russia had ambitions in 1994 when that to deploy a peacekeeping force in Karabakh, just as it had in other disputed territories in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, and that didn't happen. That was actually in the Armenians and Azerbaijanis actually jointly resisted that, and you ended up with the line of contact with no Russian peacekeepers. But they very belatedly got that in 2020. So to give that up so quickly in 2023, even before their mission was due to end, is obviously a sign of a big change in Russian strategy. Yes, just to elaborate a bit more, I think, you know, the head of Russian customs actually wrote a piece about a month ago in which he basically laid out the strategy, and it is quite clear. We've been blocked to the west, and our trade has to completely reorient to the east and the south. The south means, you know, one very choked road connection through Georgia, and also the Caspian Sea, and a railway line through Azerbaijan. You know, those of you who remember history will remember, of course, that Karabakh, there were 3 disputed provinces in the period of the First World War right up until 1921. It was Nakhchivan, it was Zangezur, and it was Karabakh. They were all 3 mixed Armenian-Azerbaijani populations. And in 1921, as we know, Azerbaijan got Nakhchivan, Armenia got Zangezur, and you had this kind of arrangement that neither side liked for Karabakh. And suddenly it's as though Karabakh is history, unfortunately for the Karabakhis, obviously. Let's hope they do return one day. But suddenly it's all about Nakhchivan and Zangezur. It's about that is Russia's link, and not only Russia's link, it's to Iran and Turkey. It's always useful to have a map, but I guess we don't have one here. But Iran's only railway to the South Caucasus goes to Nakhchivan. Currently, it's a dead end. It doesn't go anywhere. If you rebuild that railway, suddenly Azerbaijan is connected to Nakhchivan, and Russia is connected to Iran, and you know, potentially also on Turkey. So it's suddenly all about Russia getting out of this encirclement due to the war in Ukraine. I think that's the absolutely crucial fact.
Thank you. And I'd like to follow up on that. Does Russia understand itself to have failed in its mediating mission, its peacekeeping mission, or is it even a concern, or was Russia ever serious about its job in Nagorno-Karabakh?
Who can say? I think they thought they were serious back in 2020, but obviously, do they acknowledge a mistake? No. Russia never makes a mistake. It was amazing to hear the other day Sergei Lavrov, who is probably the individual who spent more years than anyone negotiating the Karabakh issue. He had many plans for it, and in Tehran last month, he suddenly said, "Oh, it's all solved. It's part of Azerbaijan now. Let's move on." He didn't acknowledge his own personal failure, the Russian state failure. Russia never admits its mistakes.
Mm-hmm. And do you know, are there any remaining Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, or does Russia see itself as having any further peacekeeping role in Karabakh right now? And what exactly are they doing there, if there are any Russian?
We see reports that some of them have gone home, of checkpoints being dismantled and so on. There's nothing for them to do. There's no peace to keep. Azerbaijan is in full control, and I think Russia does understand that, at least.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of concerns, is anything being done on the Russian side for Armenia not to leave the Collective Security Treaty Organization? And are there forces that want to cling? You just spoke a little bit about the forces that want to cling onto Russia and what their reasons might be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I'd be very interested if anyone else present has a view on that. Clearly, on the one hand, Russia has lots of levers in Armenia, including a military one, including a military base, including its allies. On the other hand, Russia doesn't want to do stuff which alienates the Armenian public, and that's obviously the energy question. You've got a dilemma there. If you're Russia, you can use energy as a weapon against Armenia. You could freeze them out this winter if you did, but that wouldn't win you many friends if you wanted to win the next election in Armenia. So I guess that is the dilemma. Russia, I think, wants to coerce Armenia to stay in the CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union. But how they do that, I don't think we've seen a proper strategy yet.
Thank you. Maybe I can direct the question to Artyom. You can weigh in on this question. Are there, any benefits or drawbacks to remaining within CSTO?
Oh, it's one of those tough questions. On paper, there are benefits, but at the end of the day, does the paper even matter when, in practical terms, the organization hasn't worked? We saw it is capable of working when there is a will. And the case of Kazakhstan, when there were attempts to remove the current leadership of Kazakhstan through a coup, what happened? Nikol Pashinyan authorized, because Armenia was the chair that year of the CSTO, Nikol Pashinyan was able to sort of authorize, with the consent of course, Vladimir Putin, and with pushing from Putin to authorize CSTO operation to bring order to the fast deteriorating situation. So we know the organization, albeit has been dysfunctional, and albeit it is not as capable as Russia would like to portray it, but it is capable of making operational changes whenever it deems so. But when it comes to Armenia, the organization absolutely hasn't worked. But also there is a prehistory to why the organization has taken a position that it has taken. Mm-hmm. And the prehistory being Armenia's when Nikol Pashinyan came to power, one of the very first things that he did was arrest General Khachaturov, which was Armenia's appointed man and the head of the CSTO, the military head of the CSTO. So the relations sort of deteriorated from there. It's not it's not happening. These issues are not happening in a vacuum. That's what I'm trying to say. And of course, it takes two to tango, and Armenia and Russia have sort of been playing these games, and you know, it is where it is because of that.
Thank you, Artyom. I want to direct my next question to Stephen. You spoke a bit about the continuities between the Russian imperial and Soviet and post-Soviet policy towards Armenia. Could you speak more about Russia's non-action or inaction, about the possible intent behind this non-action? Is this, a releasing or a slackening of to quote the title of your book, the entangled embrace?
Yeah, thank you, Arpi. Good question. And I think my answer has to, not surprisingly, go back directly to what Artyom said earlier, I think in the middle of his introductory comments. So we all have to keep in mind and have no illusions about this, that Russia, like practically every single state actor, acts in its own interests, its own domestic and foreign policy interests. It has always done that with whichever century, era, decade, or regime we're talking about, whether it's the Romanovs, whether it's the Muscovites before the Romanovs, whether it's the Soviets or the Yeltsin years or the Putin regime. They're always acting in their own interests, and that's what great powers do. That's what small powers try to do. So it's very frustrating. I mean, this is a reality we have to confront, understand, tackle, and try to make sense of in the best possible way without getting frustrated, angry, or resorting to essentialization. Every time I see people try to simplify something like Russo-Armenian ties into either quote-unquote good or quote-unquote bad, I start to get skeptical. We can, Artyom, Tom, Arpi, everyone probably here, all 49 of you here, can make a list of specific historic events that are either signs of a partnership or signs of an antagonistic relationship between Russians and Armenians. The reality is that there are plenty of anecdotal examples, plenty of specific individual cases. We have to look at the big picture to understand that they've always been both. If that's frustrating, I understand, but that's the reality. Right now, the reality for Russia's inaction is exactly what Tom emphasized. It's really the context of what's happening with the war. Since February 2022, Russian foreign policy has been affected from, Russian fishing agreements in Indonesia to arms agreements with Egypt to the Karabakh policy. So every aspect of Russian foreign policy has evolved and changed. And that's the circumstance for Russia's inaction, really. It's we can speculate all day long what Russia would have done. Would it have done anything had the war in Ukraine not occurred? But the fact of the matter is it did occur, and there's practically very little question to my mind, and I've heard very few experts argue that the distraction with Ukraine is not a key, maybe not the key, but a key factor to explain the Kremlin's inaction in 23.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to follow up on this question of embrace, and how can we understand it in terms of soft and hard power politics?
I'm sorry, was that for me?
Yes, Stephen. I was following up on the same embrace route.
Could you just repeat the question, please?
Yeah, how can we understand it in terms of the relationship in terms of soft and hard power?
Very little hard power being displayed on the ground by the Russians. They're there's very little tangible evidence that Russia has the motivation or the capability to really exert hard power, and soft power from the post-2014 Kremlin has been kind of a figment of Western imagination. So I'm not really optimistic in either scenario.
Thanks, Stephen. I wanted us to focus a bit on the usage of language and the significance of not just narratives, but specific phrases and words. In the West, especially during the Ukraine war, we've been wary of Russia's usage of special, quote unquote, special military operation, but also Azerbaijan's term for its invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh is also military operation. Yet this phrase has been widely accepted in the West and used in the media as well. And although in both cases, genocidal intent has been also attributed to Azerbaijan, what should we make of this terminological discrepancy? And maybe Tom can tackle this question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a minefield out there in any conflict. How do you describe the Israel-Gaza conflict? So I'm a bit reluctant to go there. Clearly, clearly everyone is copying each other here, trying to use. I think Azerbaijan also used the term anti-terrorist operation, which Russia had used. I remember that from Russia using that in Chechnya, who were the terrorists here, goodness knows. So I'm probably not going to particularly go there, Arpi.
All right.
That question.
All right. I can direct the question to all of you, anyone who can answer it. Are there historical equivalents to this particular invasion in Nagorno-Karabakh? If not, what exactly makes this invasion unique historical moment? We understand it's historically unique, but why is it unique? So either Stephen, Tom, or Artyom.
Artyom, go ahead.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's that unique. I mean, wars are not unique, and I'm reminded of another writer, Kurt Vonnegut, who talks about in the Slaughterhouse 55 or whatever, I can't remember the name of the book. He says a friend of his is asking what is he writing the book about, and he says is it an anti-war book? He says yes, it's an anti-war book, and his friend says, well, you might as well write an anti-glacier book because I mean, wars and glaciers are here forever. It's sort of the human condition. So I cannot speak of the uniqueness of this. It is unique in that sense that it is happening to us, and we're sort of uniquely positioned to suffer in this conflict that's sort of become a perennial for us. I don't think I have anything more wise to say on this. It's no.
Thank you, Artyom. I wanted to direct the question to Stephen about Russia being often referred to as a regional power, or at times even an imperial power right now, but also sometimes the two terms are used interchangeably in maybe non-academic circles, sometimes in academic circles. As a historian of comparative empires, could you please differentiate between what is a regional power from how does it differ from an imperial one, and why is it important to differentiate? What is Russia? Is it a regional power? Is it an imperial one? Depends who you ask.
Yeah, it depends who you ask, what kind of academics you ask. An imperial power can actually be a regional power, and we have plenty of historical examples of that from Europe, from Asia. The Austro-Hungarian Empire comes to mind immediately. If you want to insult Putin to the core, there's nothing more egregious, more embarrassing and humbling you can say to him than to call his country a regional power. That's an epithet that has been fighting since at least 2008, probably even well before that. Russia under Putin, since he came to power on the last day of the 20th century, has been portraying itself as the rightful heir to the superpower of the USSR, which portrayed itself as a tremendous improvement on the Imperial Russian foundation, yet the Soviet authorities were still very proud of the bicontinental international size and composition of the Romanov Empire. By the time it collapsed, that thing covered 8.5 square million miles and had 120 distinct ethno-national groups within its borders. Russia under Putin still tries to portray itself as not just a regional power, but also as an anti-imperial, right now in the context of the global South, as an ally of the global South, kind of global influencer, if not necessarily a power. This is why Russian ambassadors have never been busier since the 1960s, all over sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Southeast Asia, and so on. But they, of course, hate the I word. They don't want to be called an imperial power, but that's exactly the manifestation of foreign policy, trying to spread the tentacles as far out as possible. And the small post-Soviet republics, the small post-Soviet nations on the periphery are the ones who are getting more often hurt or are unhappy with these tentacles than they are happy. We can count on 2 or 3 fingers the number of post-Soviet countries who are happy with Russia's foreign policy.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to follow up with Artyom on this. Can we talk a bit more about a shift in the exertion or implementation of this power? I think not during this session, but in the past, you've used the metaphor of the mood ring or a thermometer. Could you please elaborate and also maybe comment on this term, Russia's backyard? I know you take issue with that. I know Tom also takes issue with that. But so the exertion, the shift in the power is my main question here.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you look at when I put together the book, and I read my book, that is, I read around 3,000 Russian news articles, watched way too many YouTube videos with Russian commentary on the Armenian Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that the audience would care to know. But when you look at sort of the coverage of the conflict, and within this coverage, I guess a subsection would be the Armenian-Russian relations since the beginning of the Nagorno-Karabakh movement through the collapse of the Soviet Union and until the 2020 war. You know, there are certain themes and thematics that emerge. There are certain topics that emerge. And there is a certain sort of verbiage used to cover the conflict. In the beginning of the conflict, you know, in the Soviet press, as Tom has already alluded, the coverage of the conflict was, in a sense, reflective of the Soviet Central Powers. There was a certain orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy was this: Nagorno-Karabakh is within Azerbaijan, borders cannot be changed, and so the journalistic coverage absolutely reflected it, and it did not shape sort of the thinking in the Kremlin, but it sought to shape the thinking within the broader Soviet Union. So when you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have not an orthodox view of the conflict, but sort of disparate, occasionally heretical views of the conflict. And it also is the result of the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a burgeoning scene of new Russian newspapers and media outlets that were not beholden to the Kremlin, and they were not receiving talking points from the Kremlin on any number of issues, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict among them. And so there were quite a few free-thinking journalists who sort of covered the issue whatever they wanted. But when it comes to the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, you also have to understand that issues such as prestige and access for journalists become very important. Journalists need to have access, need to have sources, need to work with sources, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, the coverage that had one mood in the beginning changes the mood as the conflict progresses. But closer you get to 2020, and closer especially you get to the election of or coming of power of Nikol Pashinyan, the tenor of the Russian press coverage begins to change. And one of the very important, not very important, but one significant article that came out in 2018, I think, or 2019, the author was Anatoly Khramchikhin, a well-known Russian military analyst and a commentator. And he published in the Nezavisimaya Gazeta sort of a foreboding article about who needs Russian-Armenian partnership more. Do Armenians need it more, or do the Russians need it more because it has a military presence? And the conclusion of the article was this, that Armenia needs Russia more. Russia is a large country, can live without Armenia just fine, which is understandable. But also, Khramchikhin called for the Armenians to have, his words, not mine, sober thinking leadership, because if Armenia doesn't heed Russia's sort of foreign policy diktat on any number of issues, whether it be CSTO or Nagorno-Karabakh or Armenia's delicate tango with the Europe and with the Americans, Russia has many more levers to influence politics on the ground. And we saw this sort of prophetic othering of Khramchikhin bear itself out with the 2020 war. Within 2 years of that article being published, the relationship absolutely deteriorated, and Russia sort of removed its protective canopy from over Armenia, allowing Azerbaijan and Turkey to have their way with Armenia and the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. So yeah, when you look at the press coverage, it is in a sense a mood ring, depending on the temperature between Armenia's and Kremlin relations. The mood changes, and the press sort of reflects this mood change in a very interesting way. I don't know if that was so. Yeah.
Thank you, Artyom. Thanks for bringing to the fore the press coverage, which certainly affects the attitudes on the ground. My next question is for Tom. I want to direct it to Tom. In the past, you've spoken about on the unwillingness to compromise on maximalist positions in the South Caucasus. How do you understand the idea of maximalism in Armenia-Russia relations as it relates to the crisis of Nagorno-Karabakh?
Yeah, I think this is a bit different. I think I don't think we're going to see. I mean, let's try and imagine what maximalism would be on both sides. On the Russian side, it would be a kind of Russian coup d'etat, maybe in Armenia or something like that, which I think would be quite risky. Certainly if it backfired, even if it succeeded. And on the Armenian side, it would be, I don't know, Armenia applying to join NATO, or which, and again, maybe some Armenians are talking about that on the kitchen table, but certainly that's not on the agenda now. I think that entangled embrace is going to continue. I think maybe what's helpful for the Armenians is obviously that Russia, President Putin wakes up in the morning and he thinks about the Ukraine, US, Armenia's, a long way down the list. So I think there's a little breathing room for Armenia, though clearly when President Putin thinks about Armenia, he doesn't do so in a very fond manner at the moment. But I think even Prime Minister Pashinyan knows that he's not going to formally quit some of these Russian-led organizations. He's just trying to build up other contacts as much as possible. The trouble is, particularly on the economy, just Armenia is so enmeshed Russia, that it's it's going to take a long time for that to change.
Thank you, Tom. I want to follow up on and go back to your earlier mentions of the Zangezur corridor. What is Russia's position in terms of the Zangezur corridor, which obviously Azerbaijan wants implemented so badly, and also the Crossroads of Peace project, the Armenian term Khachmeruk project put forth by Armenia? And if you think Russia gains or loses, or is rather maybe impartial to the implementation of these plans?
Sure. Well, I think there's a sort of an overlap, shall we say, between Azerbaijan, Russia, and Turkey on this so-called Zangezur corridor. Clearly, Azerbaijan wants a link, and it's on the basic level, it's completely normal that they want to de-isolate Nakhchivan. That they want a route across Armenia to Nakhchivan, and I guess the Armenians also don't object to that. The question is who's in control of that route, and obviously the Azerbaijanis want minimal Armenian control, which is problematic for Armenia. And what's, I think, especially problematic is the November 2020 agreement, which I think everyone agrees is now defunct, but people are still referring to. That agreement says that Russian FSB border guards should be guarding the route, and that's obviously, in the light of what's going on, unacceptable to Armenia. Iran also is worried about a kind of fenced-off corridor, which basically seals its border with Armenia. And again, we've had a kind of switcheroo with the Armenians now not wanting Russians on their territory, and the Azerbaijanis saying that they support that. So that this is where all the discussions are going on. For me, the interesting one is Turkey. I think clearly there's an incredibly tight relationship between Presidents Aliyev and Erdogan. But let's remember that wasn't always the case. 10 years ago, they were they had a lot of differences, and certainly when the protocols process was going on, Aliyev was very angry with Turkey, not to mention their kind of cultural differences. One is a pious Muslim, the other is a secularist. So and now we've got differences also over Israel, and Azerbaijan supplying energy to Israel, getting its weapons from Israel, and Erdogan calling Israel a terrorist state. So it'll be interesting to see whether, and if the Middle East war continues, whether that becomes a problem in the Azerbaijan-Turkey relationship. And I suspect they have different views on the Russians in Armenia too. That Azerbaijan seems happy, shall we say, for the Russians to stay in Armenia. They just want a weak Armenia, whereas I think a lot of Turks actually want the Russians out of Armenia, would like to see the border open. I've had many discussions in the Turkish Foreign Ministry on normalization with Armenia. I think that was taken over a bit by this different policy from Erdogan, but I think there's still quite a lot of people in Turkey who want to see that normalization happen as a way of weakening Russian influence in Armenia. But at the moment that's not happening because the relationship is so personalized, I guess, between Aliyev and Erdogan. A rather long answer. I'm sorry about that.
No, thank you, Tom. I want to follow up and, are there any pivotal decisions or decision-making by the Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan and his cabinet that we can pinpoint post-Velvet Revolution that has led to this point? I know Artyom already mentioned the arrest of Khachaturian, right? Understanding at the same time, of course, that this is not a one-way street, as he also mentioned, and the border relation demands that the consideration of both sides, essentially.
Yeah, I'm sure. Let's be honest. Whatever many things to admire about Prime Minister Pashinyan, but diplomacy is not his strong point, I would say. I think for me, the model of great diplomacy in the Caucasus is Edward Shevardnadze, who clearly wanted to chart a path of Georgia to the west. And he also got Russian troops out of Georgian territory, closed down the bases, built pipelines bypassing Russia, did lots of things, but he did that while smiling, talking to the Russians, going, and he would often go and tell Putin, for example, one story, I think Shevardnadze himself may even have told me this story, when they invited American trainers to Georgia, that actually what happened is that Shevardnadze told Putin first that he was going to do this. He said, we're inviting American trainers to Georgia. It's all about terrorism. But I wanted to let you know first, Vladimir Vladimirovich. And then Putin actually used that to say, I know, when he was asked the question, I know about this in advance and I have no problem with it, and so on. That's the kind of model about how you deal with Russia if you want to move west. And I'm afraid Pashinyan lacks the, shall we say, the diplomatic finesse of someone like Edward Shevardnadze.
Thanks, Tom. Artyom, would you like to weigh in on this question? Any pivotal decisions by the PM and cabinet that were made that you think might have led to this point?
Well, he's, I've been a strong critic of Pashinyan's domestic and foreign policy conduct, and there isn't one, there isn't two sort of decisions that he made that led to the situation that we face now. It was a cascading sort of decision after decision, and he, from his very first meeting with Putin, the way his entourage, from what I understand, had conducted itself with regard to Putin, and Putin takes these things very personally. And it's not only Armenia's fault that Armenia is sort of facing the situation it faces. It takes two to tango, but it also takes two to distango, if you will. And the breakup is happening because of the personality clashes, and because when we say Russian state, we understand Putin. And when we say Putin, we understand the Russian state. They have become almost this symbiotic, coterminous state of affairs. But I mean, the arrest of Khachaturian is one thing. I think that was one of his biggest diplomatic faux pas. The arrest of Kocharyan by luring him from Moscow first as a witness to a trial, then as a defendant. So that was another thing that comes to mind. Of course, as of late, this sort of conduct that Russia perceives to be anti-Russian has been intensified by Pashinyan. And Tom mentioned the travel of Pashinyan's wife to Kiev to meet with Zelensky's wife. The meeting of Zelensky and Pashinyan on the sidelines in Granada is another thing. And of course, Armenia's continual sort of very public annoyance towards Russia with regards to Russia's conduct to Armenia. So it's not that Armenia is wholly at fault here, or Pashinyan is wholly at fault. It's a complex situation that the Armenian government doesn't have neither the diplomatic wherewithals or the situational awareness to deal with any kind of tact or finesse or delicacy. This has become a very, very, it's like Pashinyan is taking a chainsaw to a surgery room to operate on a brain. And of course, Russia is sort of lashing out the way it thinks it only can with regards to people like Pashinyan. And Pashinyan, I mean, had a perfect two examples to consider. Saakashvili and Zelensky. Sort of consider the complexity of the situation in that way.
Thank you, Artyom. I'd like to remind the audience to please mute yourselves. I see that one of the participants, Armen Kocharyan's microphone is on. It's very distracting.
Maybe the administrator can mute him.
Hagop, are you on the ground here?
Jakob, can you please mute Armen Kochadan? Jakob?
All right, Stephen, I'm going to direct my next question to you. It's within a post-colonial framework. It's difficult to ignore the fact that some of the most prominent pro-Putin, anti-Pashinyan rhetoric within Russia are of Armenian heritage. I'm thinking specifically of Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as Margarita Simonyan, the head of RT, who infamously called Armenia ungrateful Armenia. Can we apply the political philosopher Frantz Fanon's idea, for example, that a colonized subject must constantly be aware of his image and jealously protect his position? Do you think it's useful to apply this to such figures? And if so, how does that help us understand the current state of Armenia-Russia relations? And if not, is there a better framework? I'll formulate the question a bit differently for Artyom to respond to after Stephen weighs in to this question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. From the perspective of ethnic Armenians born and raised in Russia, full-blooded Armenians such as Simonyan and half Armenians such as Lavrov, nothing better on the face of this planet has ever happened to the Armenian nation than their encounter with Russian culture, the Russian benevolent state, Russian patronage, Russian supply of energy in the post-Soviet era. We talk about 80–85% of gas that Armenia famously or infamously receives from Russia. We don't talk about the fact that Armenia gets 98 or 99% of its wheat from Russia. And this is something that people, not just as Simonyan and very rarely, but maybe a little more nowadays, Lavrov point out, but Medvedev likes to point this out. He has over the past couple of years as well. So the attitude has been for a long time among Russian political elites that the Armenians need to know their place. They need to recognize how good they have historically headed, and they cannot get uppity. They cannot speak out too vociferously when something we do for our own interests happens to not coincide with their own interests. And case in point is exactly what both Tom and Artyom have been the specific examples that Tom and Artyom have brought, everything from Pashinyan's wife visiting Kiev to the Kochadan's arrest, to trial, to the rest of the general. All of these things always elicited either a very strong and public reaction from the Kremlin that made international news, or if you pay even more close attention without just looking at the headlines of the most major news outlets, you see more subtle signs of Russian discontent, which the Russians, you think Pashinyan's foreign policy is a little clumsy. They like to pretend that they have some of the most sophisticated foreign diplomatic training corps in Eurasia, but they can be very clumsy as well. A very good indicator of Russian geopolitical displeasure with Armenia for the past 3 decades has been the price that the Russian authorities have set for gas. It is almost always well below market price. But whenever the government, whether it's under Sarkisyan or now Pashinyan, has done something that goes against the Kremlin's wishes, the price inches closer to the market price. And if the Armenians are paying the same price as a non-Soviet republic for Russian gas, things are really bad. So there's always been this not just condescending and imperial inspired attitude, but a very patronizing attitude that we will show you that you belong in a certain place. And the reality is that there are very few tangible ways in which even the most sophisticated, even the most creative, even the most well-prepared Armenian diplomats can maneuver in the space between a rock and a hard place that they're in. Yes, I totally agree with Artyom that it's cringeworthy to see some of the missteps. But at the same time, as imaginative as I like to think I am, it's hard for me to come up with much better responses, much better reactions to some of these circumstances that faced in the recent past.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to, if Artyom can weigh in on this question of Russian propaganda as well. What is the effect of these prominent voices of Russian propaganda? Is it possible to quantify it? Not just Simonian, of course, but also Vladimir Solovyov, the host of the popular Solovyov show, and others on Armenia-Russia relations, and how Armenia is viewed by the Russian public. What can we learn about how Russia manipulates information space about Armenia-Russia relations through these figures, or does it really to the extent that we think it does?
Yeah, I think it does have influence, and the influence is quite visible and quite actually marked. There's a the lone sort of independent Russian polling organization, Levada Center, who has been declared as a foreign agent by the Russian government, over the years has been conducting polls with regards to Armenian and Azerbaijan Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And I think they started sort of doing something more specialized and more niching in 2016 with the breakout of the 2016 four-day war, the April war between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, when Azerbaijan first time sort of tested waters to solve the conflict violently. I think in 2016, there's numbers I can look up, but about a month or so ago, I went to Levada Center's website looking up for these numbers. And during the 2016 conflict, I think the poll was the 2%, 10% of the Russians, or maybe the 14% of the Russians. I cannot guarantee the numbers. 14% of the Russians were looking at the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, more favoring towards Armenia, and only 6% were favoring Russia. The second round of polling that they did was in 2020. Armenia's support had gone down by about 4%. Azerbaijan's support had gone down by about 2%. And in 2023, they also, right after the conflict or during the conflict, they also again ran some polls, and you can see the inverse having happened. More Russians were supporting Azerbaijan in the conflict than Armenia. And so within a mere 7-8 years, you have an inversion of support within the Russian public towards the conflict. And this cannot be but explained by the barrage of bad coverage of Armenia in the Russian press, having to do, of course, with the deteriorating relations between Armenia and Russia, and between Putin and Pashinyan. So we can sort of chart and look at these numbers, and Levada is more or less reliable. And I have watched the press coverage on the liberal Dozh TV channel. I've read Russian, even the Novaya Gazeta, which is the darling of the Russian liberals, even its coverage, despite sort of its liberal credentials, has been not that positive when it comes to Armenia. But when it comes to the mainstream government beholden media outlets in Russia, the coverage of Armenia, the coverage of Pashinyan, and the coverage of the Nagorno-Karabakh issue is completely in a different sort of trajectory than it used to be. So yes, the propaganda has borne fruit, and the fruit is poisonous for the Armenians, if you will. And it's not altogether salutary,
Thanks, Artyom. If I can follow up, on this train of thought since the beginning of the mobilization in Russia during the Ukraine war. There has been an influx of Russians and Armenians from Russia to Armenia, especially in the capital Yerevan. And how can we understand this changing relationship in terms of not just the demographics of Armenia at the moment, but also a potential of a pro or anti-Russian shift? Or is this even a concern at all?
It is not probably a concern right now, but down the road it may become an issue of concern. A lot of the Russians that have come to Armenia have come for a couple of reasons. One of them is that their credit cards and their bank cards work in Armenia, unlike in any other country, because the Russian banks have been sanctioned and so on and so forth. The other part of the crowds that have come to Armenia is they're quite liberal. They're opposed to the war in Ukraine, initiated by Russia, and they look at Armenia as sort of this oasis, in a post-Soviet oasis, where their views, whether tacit or quite visible, are just okay. They're not going to be persecuted. They're not going to be handed over to the Russian government. And also they understand that the dynamic of Armenian-Russian relations there is such that the Armenian government, in most likelihood, will not hand over any sort of dissidents back to Russia to be persecuted, and so on and so forth. But these things, are always in flux. These things never remain the same. These things can always change. And down the road, the dynamic of these migrants can change, and their thinking may change. So right now, I don't think it's a big issue, but down the road, it may become an issue, though it also may not. We don't know it. We don't have enough sort of data. I haven't seen any sociological study done with regards to the attitudes of these Russians. We're just guesstimating, and the evidence is anecdotal. My conversations with these people show that right now it may not be an issue, but again, we don't know what happens in the future.
And Artyom, what is the role of the Armenian diaspora in the United States when it comes to attitudes in Armenia towards Russia?
Oh, I've never even considered that, but of course there is. Yeah, and it also probably has to do with generations. The younger generation of Armenian diasporans that are looking at the conflict or are looking at the dynamic, they're probably take a much dimmer view of Armenian-Russian relations. The younger generation is more sort of socially and politically aware than the older generation. This is not a swipe at the older generation. I am becoming one of your representatives, and so when I'm making this commentary, it's also a commentary on my own self. But I think the older generation sort of doesn't have this view, doesn't hold this dim of a view with the Armenian-Russian conflict. And also, you have to look when we speak about the Armenian diaspora in the United States, we have to understand that it's also not a monolith. It is a mosaic, and there are a million different diasporas, if you will. There is a lot of diasporas. The Baku Armenian diaspora, for instance, holds a completely different view from the Armenian diaspora reps that have their origins in the Soviet Armenia, for instance. And those differ from the Armenians from Syria and Lebanon and from Polis. So this is not a monolithic perception. But what we can talk about is that maybe the diaspora can help the population and the Armenian body politic by sort of ensconcing itself in the population, moving to Armenia, perhaps, getting into the educational field, getting in professional fields, and affect change that way, rather than waving a fist from the comforts of our homes here.
Thank you, Artyom. I want to direct my next question to Stephen. We're all aware of Putin's embrace of the role as a defender of Christian traditional values, but also Russia's historically, at least on paper, coming to defend its Christian allies. You know, what is the role of this allyship vis-a-vis religion, and how can we understand that today?
Yeah, it's a really good question. But if I may back up just a bit, I really want to amplify what Artyom was saying, because this is a really important point that it's a very basic, it's a fundamental point that I don't hear acknowledged often enough. There is no such thing as a unified monolithic Armenian diaspora. There's no monolithic Armenian viewpoint on things. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing is debatable. I'm not sure there should be a monolithic unified view on everything. But you know, earlier we're talking about, you asked an excellent question about the effect, the tangible effect of propaganda in Russian, whether it's Solovyov or Simonyan or others. Many of us, I think, have acquaintances. We have friends. Some people here might even have family members who are ethnic Armenians living in Russia, who've lived there for a long time. When you talk to them, my anecdotal sense, I don't have stats to back this up, but my sense is that 7 out of 10 times, 8 out of 10 times, they are going to be echoing Kremlin propaganda. And I don't know if that's necessarily because they drank the Kool-Aid prepared by Simonyan and Solovyov, or because they feel that the country in which they have lived for decades, whether they came there after the collapse or even have stayed there before, have lived there since before 91, that country has provided them with a good home that's given them economic opportunity, family stability, social mobility, and so on. So I personally have encountered plenty of very politically engaged, very attentive Armenians, mainly older probably generations, if we're rightly talking about Artyom's emphasis on generational divides. But some of them, man, they have attitudes that almost make Solovyov look like a moderate when it comes to not just Pashinyan individually. That's easy to find. We can all find 10 of those. But we, you know, I keep encountering people in different contexts, Armenians from Russia who are hypercritical of Armenian foreign policy. And it's practically, you get the sense after 30, 45 minutes with them that there's not a single thing that official Yerevan could do differently to really placate them, as long as the Kremlin doesn't put out a banner saying, "Thank you, Yerevan, we are happy with you," or "We are content with you."
Thank you, Stephen. If you can also tackle the religion question.
The religion question, the connection between
Russia as presenting itself as a defender of Christian traditional values historically. What is the role of this allyship between Armenia and Russia vis-a-vis religion?
Yeah, historically, it's a huge aspect of largely, and I know this is controversial, but the argument I make in my book is that for the first 3/4 of the century is a largely symbiotic partnership. A key aspect of that, a specific institution, was Echmiadzin. A key aspect of that discussion was the similarity of the apostolic and Orthodox faiths, and also just the geopolitical calculation when the ethnic Armenians were surrounded by Muslims, both Shia and Sunni. Nowadays, though, you know, Tom and Artyom can correct me if I'm wrong, my sense is that this is hardly a frequently cited factor from either side. I don't really see high ecclesiastical leaders from the Russian Orthodox Church citing this focus on family values as something that their Armenian counterparts can or should be actively taking part is. I've hardly really seen that in the most modern context. But historically, Arpi, you're absolutely right. Throughout the 19th century, from way before 1801, Artyom made comments earlier about Israel Ori. Israel Ori reached St. Petersburg and he chatted with Peter the Great, thanks to the financial support, the funding of, and the actual networks, the logistical support of the Armenian ecclesiastical representatives. So the church played a tremendously vital role as a mediator between the quote-unquote Armenian nation, the stateless Armenian nation, and the Imperial Russian state throughout the 19th century. And that's why one of the few specific examples I mentioned in my introductory remarks was the confiscation of Echmiadzin's properties in 1903. That was very dramatic and a very egregious Russian attack on the Armenian cultural foundation, really the heart of the Armenian nation. Without a state and a political leadership, the Armenian church was the leader of the nation. And when Nicholas II, who was very malleable, who was very easily influenced by his advisor, was convinced to attack the Armenian church, this elicited a tremendous response, not from just within the Russian Empire, but the global. That's why I use the term the global diaspora in the context of 1903. I've done quite a bit of research on this, and in the Russian archives, we have letters from Armenians in Wisconsin writing to the Russian Foreign Ministry saying, what are you people doing? Read your history to understand how closely we have worked with you for a long time. So anyway, I'm getting into the weeds here, but that's my blabbering response.
Thank you, Stephen. And one more question for Tom about the power vacuum. The apparent failure of Russia to preserve peace in Nagorno-Karabakh has obviously raised questions about a power vacuum in the region, and how would such a power vacuum affect Armenia? Is it realistic to imagine another power stepping in, the US, the EU, or even Iran? Maybe Tom can, I'm sure Artyom also has ideas about this, but if we can start with Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're seeing, I think we're back to if we're back to any era, it's one of kind of multiple powers contestation in the South Caucasus, whether that be Russia, which hasn't completely left, still has troops on the ground, Iran, which wants to be more assertive, Turkey, which obviously under Erdogan has a much more assertive role, and you've also got European Union monitors they're only monitors, but it's quite significant in southern Armenia. So you've got this. We're not talking 1920, 21 when one power can kind of sweep the board and take over everything. We're talking about three independent states who, some of which are stronger than others. Armenia obviously being the weakest of the three at the moment, but no one's fundamentally, I think, questioning their sovereignty. It's just all about jockeying for influence, and it's a rather chaotic picture. It's not a very attractive picture, but it's not. We're not all the way back in 1914. We're still we're going backwards, but we're still in the 21st century.
Thank you, Tom. Artyom, would you like to weigh in on the power vacuum question?
Yeah, like Tom is saying, there isn't really a vacuum. There is an appearance of a vacuum, and there is a chaos. And the Russians have this word, right? Свято место пусто не бывает. A holy place is never empty. And the region for regional and extra-regional actors is quite attractive as this quote-unquote holy place. So what we're saying is sometimes delicate and sometimes indelicate, dense, as who will ultimately claim this holy place for its geopolitical interest. But in this game, it's the Armenians that sort of end up bearing the brunt of this clashing geopolitical and political interest and cultural interests. Yeah, it's a veritable mess. Really, I mean, we sort of have intimations of where this is going, and where this may end up going can either become an attractive place to visit and to relax, or a very unattractive place not to go and to even visit and relax. So we don't know with any sort of degree of certainty as to what we will end up with, but it is a critical time in Armenia's history, and I hope and pray that things won't get any more worse than they have already got.
Thank you, Artyom. And my next question to whomever will take it, coming to the end of my questions here. I'm not sure if much research has been done or any at all on this topic, but it'd be interesting to hear more about what role social media has played on the quickly changing events on the ground during the Karabakh crisis, but also in perceptions within Armenia and Russia about this conflict. The social media effect can certainly be characterized, I would say, as interesting or sometimes even illuminating and sometimes totally destructive. If anyone has any remarks on this, please go ahead.
Well, let me just say, I'm sorry, Artyom, do you want to go ahead? No, I mean, I'll
No,
just
go
say,
ahead, go ahead.
I mean, for me, I would love to live in a world before social media. I find it a very unpleasant experience myself being on it. It's, you know, everyone, particularly we see this in the Israel-Gaza conflict, you know, people using it to appeal to their in-group and attack the out-group, you know, nuance disappears, very polarizing. You know, it allows all sorts of people across the world to get involved in a conflict who, in the pre-social media, would just have, you know, complained to their wife or gone down the pub. And I have a very overwhelmingly negative feeling about it, to be honest.
Thank you, Artyom.
Yeah, I look at the social media as a weapon of mass distraction. It is one thing to hear a bird tweet in the forest and quite enjoy it. It is another thing when you have 2 billion birds tweeting, and it becomes a very unenjoyable experience. And I mean, there is, I guess, upsides and downsides of it, but it has been tremendously weaponized by quite nefarious actors to drive a certain type of discourse. Yeah, just like anything, I guess. You can use a knife to cut your bread, and you can use your knife to stab someone. So it has both downsides and upsides to this. And I hope we lived in a world where these things didn't exist and I could just read another Dostoevsky novel, but I end up at the end of the day reading some rotten tweets and probably producing some of my own.
Thank you, Artyom. Thank you for the metaphors as well. One final question from me. You know, as researchers, scholars, as journalists, we always consider our audience. Who do you think your primary audience is, Tom?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, my audience would be whoever listens. Clearly, I went into this as someone, as a Westerner, trying to illuminate this region to a Western audience. But as time went on, I increasingly had a local audience, which is also had its good sides and its downsides as well. But I'm never stopped on the street in London by someone who says, "I like what you wrote," but I have been stopped on the street in Yerevan, in Tbilisi, and in Baku by people saying, "I like what you write." So it's amazing who's out there.
Thanks, Tom. Stephen?
Whoever is interested, whoever is paying attention, whoever is awake. You know, I write for people who want to understand the past a little better, and I think that's all we can really hope for. We should always avoid writing to a very narrow audience that's not particularly useful. We should avoid the tendency to be in a little vacuum chamber. We all know each other well. We've all read each other's works a lot, but just even looking at this small group of people here, I think it's wonderful. We have a wide range of people. One of the leading historians of the Ottoman Armenians is here, Richard Artamian. A lot of other people are here who are studying not just international relations, sociology, political science, or history, but economics, engineering, and other things. So whoever is serious and is paying attention is very welcome. I think the best we can do is make our work as accessible, not just relevant, but accessible as possible to the broadest possible audience. Obviously, I'm not saying we need to simplify things to the point of absurdity, but make it really accessible and make it fun for people to read something new.
Thank you, Stephen. And Artyom?
Well, my primary audience is probably me, because I mostly vent my frustrations. But joking aside,
come on, you have become such a curmudgeon. You're not your own.
So no, I mean, I try to reach a diverse group of audiences. I try to be non-parochial. I try to be, reaching to Armenians, Russians, the Brits, the Americans, whoever wants and is willing to listen to what I have to say. Sometimes I say interesting things. Sometimes I say dumb things, but then I am a human and I reflect the human condition. I am not perfect, but I will never try to become one. As my karate coach once told me, you're never going to be perfect, but never let anyone from stopping you to achieve this perfection. So I sort of look at this in my writings, in my public talking, and so on and so forth. Whoever wants to listen to it.
Thank you, Artyom. Thanks, everyone. And I think it's a great segue to audience questions. And Hagop will be reading the audience questions. And if your question hasn't been read, it's simply because maybe it's already been answered by our participants. Hagop, please.
Thank you, Arpi, and thank you all the panelists for this very interesting discussion. And here are some questions. Vartan Perumyan asks, why are those rail transit routes so important to the context of Western sanctions? Much of the intelligence information suggests that Russia has a very large degree of autonomy with respect to its natural resources, ability to manufacture all the weapons it needs, energy security and independence, ability to feed its population, etc. So this is the question. Anyone?
Maybe that's, for sure. Russia also is like every other country needs supply chains, and it's just lost its European supply chain, and it's trying to rebuild one, particularly via the Middle East and from China. And for that reason, I think the southern route is incredibly important to Russia. I couldn't put figures on it, but I read what the Russians themselves are writing about this and how important it is to them.
Any others?
Yeah, Russia is a vast country, but vast countries need foreign trade to balance their books. Russia is quite self-sufficient, but at the same time, self-sufficiency can last you only so long. So it's quite natural for Russia to look for outlets to compensate for the economic losses that it has incurred in the wake of the war and being shut out of the European market. So it becomes quite essential for its economic growth and for its economic, at least, maintenance. So there is no other way of looking at it but that. And Russia, of course, has always wanted to have routes to the south, to warmer waters, if you will. And this is just another way of sort of charting out that plan.
Yeah, I'll just add that there are very specific economic reasons. There are specific political, practical reasons, but it's also a question of prestige. Russia does not want to be forced to become a giant North Korea, so they are very much invested in developing new routes, improving existing ones, developing new routes to compensate for the ones that have been closed down in order not to be perceived as a pariah state. So we can expect them to continue to expand these efforts for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. All right, now the next question is from Minas Tanyelyan. It says, what is the cause of this Armenian lack of self-interest in the past, and is that changing? Anyone wants to answer that?
Yeah, I don't think there is a lack of self-interest per se. There is certainly what I'm trying to say is that not having statehood for the last 800 years has done a trick in the Armenian social and political imagination. And being part of an empire, or being part of 3 different empires, has sort of created a certain muscle memory within the Armenian social and political thinking. And these muscle memories do not usually go away all that easily. There is another type of muscle memory that needs to be built, and be built on strong institutional foundations, a strong, robust, educational foundations, and so on and so forth. But the transition has not been all that positive as one would have imagined it to be. So I think that's one of the reasons. It's not that there is no self-interest, is that the self-interest lacks a certain verve, a certain robustness to it. And hopefully within the next generation or two, that imagination, the Armenian political imagination, the Armenian educational system will become more robust, and there is new forms of thinking emerges as a result of this catastrophe. And I think it is then sort of the time has necessitated for these changes to take place, because no one is coming to Armenia's rescue but Armenians. Russians won't do it, the Americans won't do it, the Iranians won't do it. And if Armenians don't do it, it's all but guaranteed that Armenia may stop existing as a political entity. So it is time to sort of shore up our resources and put to good use our collective wisdom, provided we have one.
Anyone else?
Yeah, absolutely. This constant need for foreign pity, for foreign concern, for foreign intervention. It might have some limited benefits. It might bring a few constrained, tangible advantages, but overall, the more we ask, or the more the Armenian government or the Armenian people, the Armenian diaspora asks for foreign solutions to domestic problems, the longer this crisis will continue. In my personal opinion, this is not based on any research. In my personal opinion, there is no bigger threat to Armenia's future than institutionalized corruption. If Armenia is going to continue to develop its very young democracy, then institutionalized, deep-rooted corruption in different sectors has to be targeted as if it were a foreign enemy intruder, targeted for destruction. Corruption is a cancer in most probably post-Soviet republics, and Armenia is no exception. We must have absolutely no illusions about the fact that this is a pervasive, disgusting reality of the economy, of politics, of many engagements there. But yeah, and stop just obsessing over foreign intervention. As Artyom said, nobody's coming to help Armenia. Nobody's coming to help Armenians. It doesn't hurt to ask, but we cannot only say we're going to wait until some savior comes to help us.
Okay, thank you. I think we've already covered enough, and I appreciate your participation, everybody. And if you like what ARPA Institute is doing, please donate so that we can do more in Armenia. And thank again to the excellent panelists and this excellent discussion and the moderator. Next, we're going to have in December, hopefully, a panel discussion on teaching history in the schools of Armenia, because there are new issues related to what they write in the history books that they use to teach the school children. And so we are going to discuss that and evaluate the situation. Thank you very much, and hope to see you next.
Thank you, Hago.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.